of all, thank you all for taking the time to be at this event. This is the 2025 Annual Torrance Lecture. This event is made possible mainly by the tireless efforts of the staff and students who work with us in the Torrance Center at UGA, and I just absolutely cannot express how grateful I am to my whole team for all their work in bringing this event and the associated conference we had all day today to fruition. The annual Torrance Lecture was selected this year as the UGA Fall 2025 Signature Lecture, and we at the Torrance Center are very, very grateful to the Office of the Provost at UGA for this unique recognition as well. My name is Anna Abraham. I'm the E. Paul Torrance Professor here at UGA, and I also serve as the Director of the Torrance Center, which was founded, I think, 41 years ago now, in honor of Professor E. Paul Torrance, a pioneer in creativity research in education. So the Torrance Center was founded upon Professor Torrance's retirement in 1984 by Dr. Mary Fraser, who was his colleague and friend at the Department of Educational Psychology. And the very first distinguished lecture named in his honor took place 2 years after he passed in 2005 and has taken place annually ever since. The annual Torrance Lecture for us provides us something that we can do uniquely, which is to provide a platform to recognize exceptional scholars and practitioners who have vitally expanded our understanding of human creativity. It is an extraordinary privilege for me to be here 20 years on from that very first lecture, to welcome all of you to this flagship event of the Torrance Center, and to be able to introduce our distinguished speaker for the 2025 annual lecture. Professor Teresa Amabile is the Edsel Bryant Ford Professor Emerita at Harvard Business School. Before she commenced her endowed professorship at Harvard in 1995, she was at Brandeis University, I keep saying this wrong, for 16 years. She began at Brandeis directly after she received a PhD in psychology from Stanford University. Now, for any academic working in the fields of creativity, Professor Teresa Amabile needs no introduction whatsoever, because her name is synonymous and among the most recognizable within our field. She is renowned for her seminal contributions on delineating the central role of intrinsic motivation in creativity across educational and workplace contexts. Her research has vitally informed how organizational structures and practices can be reformed and designed to enable innovation in the workplace. The theory of creativity that she proposed in the 1980s, the componential theory of creativity, remains among the most highly influential works of scholarship in the field. I think the paper that first introduced this theory, The Social Psychology of Creativity, a componential conceptualization, has received more than 15,000 citations to date. That's not all. The uniquely versatile technique she employed to assess creativity, which is called the consensual assessment technique, or the CAT, is among the most widely used creativity assessment tools and is considered to be the gold standard, as it can be employed across age groups and across domains of human endeavor, be it in the context of artistic creativity, scientific creativity, or social creativity, as in the case of public policy or business. She has authored several books. The most famous of these is Creativity in Context, which has been cited over 17,000 times to date. She's received numerous prestigious awards and honors over her career. To just take a couple of examples, she was inducted to the Thinkers 50 Hall of Fame in 2024. She received an honorary doctorate from the BI Norwegian School of Management in Oslo in 2019. She's the winner of the 2018 Lifetime Achievement Award from the Organizational Behavior Division of the Academy of Management for her pioneering work on creativity in organizations. She's the recipient of the 2017 Distinguished Scholar from the Society of Personality and Social Psychology, which is the division of the American Psychological Association. The highly prestigious PLOS Biology Journal in 2020 named Professor Amabile as one of the top 50 scholars in the whole field of business management. Now, these are some of her recent honors. This is a very difficult CV to sort of summarize. But actually, her trailblazing path was really widely recognized as very early on, as far back as the 90s. In fact, I dug up an old interview done with Professor Paul Torrance, for whom the Torrance Center was named, that was published in 1998 in the Educational Psychology Review. And he was asked who he considered to be among the leading figures in creativity. And so he listed 12, and the first in that list was Teresa Amabile, and he went further. He said, let me find that quote. He goes on to state, in my opinion, the four most important living figures in creativity are Sidney Parnes, Frank Barron, Teresa Amabile, and Calvin Taylor. And he gives a reason for why this is, and he says, Teresa Amabile is important because of her contributions to the social psychology of creativity and for reaching a different audience than the others. I think Professor Torrance was spot on in his assessment. Even as far back in the 90s, most of the esteemed scholars in the field of creativity have had a significant impact on our scholarship, of course, but very rarely does it extend beyond our particular fields of study. Professor Amabile's work, in contrast, has had an enormous impact across domains in multiple disciplines, including developmental psychology, education, cognitive science, and business. And this makes her really a singular figure in the field. For me personally, as a scholar within this field, there were two things in particular that made Professor Amabile stand apart. First, for me, her work shifted the dominant focus of seeing creativity from the sole point of view of the individual towards recognizing the power exerted by the social context on the ability of an individual, any individual, to be creative. Her work made clear that there was a dynamic interplay between the individual and the wider social environment, as the latter could kind of exert either a nurturing or a crushing influence on the realization of any individual's creative potential. Second, her work fundamentally shifted another dominant idea, namely that creative achievement is necessarily associated with suffering or the negative experiences of poor mental health. Her work kind of showed the opposite, that creativity was associated with uniquely positive experiences, as it was grounded in the personal experiences of meaningfulness and flourishing in the individual. Both these strands come together in helping us understand how to tackle the growing problem of worker disengagement, which leads to reduced productivity in workplaces. Professor Amabile's work has revealed the necessity for work settings to provide employees a sense of meaningfulness in the purpose of their mission, which leads to the trifecta of increased job satisfaction, increased employee creativity, and increased productivity at the workplace. What Professor Amabile's work does, in my opinion, is to provide a truly humanistic lens from which to understand the unique potential each of us as individuals possess and the role that each of us plays within our collective to nurture the creative spirits of the people we work together with. We at the Torrance Center are deeply grateful and honored to have Professor Teresa Amabile deliver the 2025 annual Torrance Lecture on the topic, A Labor of Love, Insights from a Creativity Research Program. Please join me in welcoming Professor Amabile to the stage.
Anna, thank you so much for that beautiful introduction. I am absolutely delighted to be here with you today, sharing some insights from my 45 years of creativity research. I have two aims today. One is to share some of the discoveries from that research that I consider particularly interesting and useful, and I hope that you will as well. My second aim is to share a bit of the journey that I've taken in my own path to try to understand creativity, including some of the difficult twists and turns in that journey. So let me begin with one of my favorite quotes. This is from a person that very few people have heard of. I had never heard of him when I found an interview with him in 1982, I think. His name is Arthur Shavlov. He was a Nobel Prize-winning physicist for his work on lasers. He was being interviewed, and the interviewer asked him, "What do you think makes the difference between the more creative scientists and the less creative scientists?" And this is what he said: "The labor of love aspect is important. The most creative scientists are not the most talented, but the ones who are just impelled by curiosity. They've got to know what the answer is." So I was just thrilled when I saw this quote, as a young assistant professor of psychology at Brandeis University, because this quote encapsulates what at that point was, and I think still is, the main discovery of my creativity research. And that is that intrinsic motivation drives creativity. The labor of love drives creativity. I was also excited by this because it really describes my own drive as a researcher. And that is, when it comes to creativity, I've got to know what the answer is. And that really continued as my motivation for many decades of research in this topic. Also, going back to the beginning of my research career and continuing to the present time, I owe an enormous debt of gratitude to the many mentors I had and colleagues and students who collaborated with me on research, and the many others who were involved in some way. So I'm going to ask you to join me in a moment of silent appreciation as I flash some of the names, some of the more prominent names of people that I've worked with up on the screen. That's a lot of names, isn't it? So I first began wondering about creativity due to a memorable event when I was 5 years old. I'm not going to tell you about it, but you can ask me about it later if you'd like. I began my formal study of creativity when I was a doctoral student at Stanford. And you'll see the first name up there is Mark Lepper. I was Mark's advisee, and I had been fascinated by a finding in some research that he had finished just before I started my doctoral program. Mark had discovered that when children did an activity that they had been previously very interested in doing, when they did that activity in order to get a reward, their intrinsic interest in that activity declined. This was a stunning finding in the early 1970s when behaviorism still held sway in a lot of psychology. I began wondering if creativity might somehow be affected by intrinsic versus extrinsic motivational states. So the idea is that when someone is working in order to get a reward, they're extrinsically motivated. That is an extrinsic motivator. And doing something for its own sake because it's enjoyable is intrinsically motivating. So I wondered if that social environmental factor of offering a reward or some other extrinsic motivator might influence the creativity with which the activity was done. I got some promising results in a preliminary study. It did suggest that creativity might be undermined by extrinsic motivators. But when I told my dissertation advisors, who included Mark Lepper and Lee Ross, as well as Daryl Bem and Philip Zimbardo, when I told them that I wanted to study creativity for my dissertation, and that moreover, I very modestly said, I wanted to establish a social psychology of creativity, they were very concerned and they tried to discourage me. They said, well, you did get promising results in this preliminary small study, but no one is studying the social psychology of creativity. No one is studying the effects of social environmental factors on creativity. Most research in the field, and I knew this because I had looked into the literature, most research in the field is on creative thinking techniques or the special characteristics of highly creative children or highly creative adults. And they cautioned, a lot of the research that's been done to date on creativity isn't great methodologically. So the subfield has kind of a poor reputation in psychology. So pick a different topic for your dissertation. Like most doctoral students, I ignored their advice. And fortunately, like most dissertation advisors, they ended up being very supportive of the work that I did. I had to do a lot of background work before I could begin my studies because I wanted to have people in my studies under different social environmental conditions make something that could then be rated on creativity. So I had to specify my conceptual definition of creativity and my operational definition of creativity, how I was going to measure it. So let me show you the definitions that I used. Creativity is a novel and appropriate response to an open-ended task or problem. And appropriate can mean different things in different domains. It can mean something that's useful or correct or valuable or expressive of some meaning that, if we're talking about art, that the artist intends to convey. This definition was not original with me. It had been used by many others in the field previously. Mo Stein and many others had been using this definition. In order to assess creativity of products that people would make in my studies, I developed this operational definition, and that is that something is creative to the extent that appropriate observers agree it's creative. And this is what Anna referred to earlier as the consensual assessment technique. If you have people who are familiar, say, with children's artwork, independently, separately from each other, come in and judge children's artworks relative to one another on creativity. If those independent judges agree, then we can say that the average of their ratings can be considered a measure of the creativity of that product. So armed with this consensual assessment technique, I was ready to tackle my big question, and that is, how does the social environment influence creativity? I was trained as an experimentalist at Stanford, so I gravitated to the experimental method, and I think that it was very useful at this point in the development of the field of the social psychology of creativity to use a method where causality can be pinpointed, the experimental method. And it was certainly a useful starting place for me because I didn't know how to do any other research methods. So I used experiments. I'm going to describe that preliminary study that I mentioned a few minutes ago. It was an extremely simple study. Most of my experiments after that point were much more complex, but this will give you a good idea of the experimental approach that I took in my research. This study was done with children who lived in the apartment complex I lived in Palo Alto, California when I was in grad school. We call it the Art Party study. And I had two assistants working with me in this study. They were my sisters, Carolyn and Phyllis, who were at that time living in Palo Alto. So this study looked at the effect of competitive reward on children's artistic creativity. I randomly put invitations in the different mailboxes where I knew there were children living in the household. I randomly invited them to an art party on Saturday or Sunday, the same weekend. It was in the community center of this apartment complex. At both parties, we had games and snacks and art-oriented activities, a variety of things. When the children came in, we gave them each a name tag, and the name tags had numbers on them, just random numbers. But each one had a different number. And the activity that we were really interested in, because that was going to provide the dependent variable of creativity, was the very last activity. It was making a collage using a white piece of poster board and a set of origami papers that were absolutely identical for each child participating in this study. And we had these laid out on tables at the back of the room during the party, so we had the kids go back there to do this collage making activity. Poster, paper, and origami paper, and a little thing of glue. So all of that was the same, and we said, we want you to make a collage that will look silly, that has a silly feeling to it. On Saturday, we, before the collage activity, showed the kids 3 toys and said, you know, you each have a number on your name tag. Well, we've got those numbers on pieces of paper in this bowl, and after this last art activity, then we're going to have a raffle. And we'll choose somebody to come up here, and we'll blindfold them, and they'll pick out 3 pieces of paper, and the first one that comes out, the kid with that number will get their choice of these 3 toys. And they were pretty attractive, appealing toys to these kids. So they knew that we would have the raffle, but they did the collage activity. So this was the no competitive reward condition. No evaluation of the collages, no competition, no reward. On Sunday, everything was the same, except we told the kids, we are going to judge the collages when they're all done, and we will pick the 3 best. And the very best, the kid who made the very best will get to pick their choice of the toys, and the second best will get to choose among the remaining toys, and so on. All right? And then I had artists from the Stanford Art Department, graduate students from the Stanford Art Department come in individually, and I had made a little gallery in the lab room hanging up all of these collages, and they just had an identifying number on the front. And of course I intermixed the Saturday collages and the Sunday collages. The judges had no idea about the experiment at all, except they knew these were made by kids. And we asked them to judge them relative to each other on the level of creativity using Likert scales. And there was a good degree of agreement among I think it was 12 or 14 judges in this experiment. And the Saturday collages, where there were no extrinsic motivators, were rated as significantly more creative by these judges than the Sunday collages. And that's one of the toys, that's another one of the toys. I can't remember what the third toy was. and here are a few paper collages. So that was the basic experimental paradigm that I expanded on over the years, looking at different domains of creativity, different extrinsic motivators. This one actually combined 3 extrinsic motivators: the expectation or promise of reward, evaluation, and competition. And we did studies with both children and adults. After several years of these experiments, I had discovered a lot about how factors in the social environment can influence intrinsic motivation and creativity. Unfortunately, and specifically, I discovered 6 reliable methods for killing creativity. Number 1 is expected evaluation, and you saw in that preliminary study that we had that. 2 is surveillance, or being watched while you're working. Contracted for reward, doing something in order to get a reward. Constraint in how to do a task. Competition with peers, and simply focusing on extrinsic reasons for doing what you're doing. Just having that uppermost in your mind while you're working. There's a wonderful story about T.S. Eliot that right after the great English writer, right after he had won the Nobel Prize in Literature, he was walking down the street with a very solemn and discouraged look on his face, and he ran into an old friend. And the friend said, "Congratulations on the prize, old boy. It's high time, I would say." And Eliot, very gloomy, said, "It's rather too soon, I would say. The Nobel is a ticket to one's own funeral. No one has ever done anything after he got it." I don't know where Eliot collected his data, but he definitely felt that this was going to be the death of his creativity. There was an American poet named Anne Sexton who had quite a bit of success in the 1960s and 70s, and her poetry is still selling quite well. She had attained some success with her first couple of books of poetry, and she had an agent who was negotiating a deal for her next book of poetry with a couple of publishers were vying to get the contract. And she received a letter from the agent asking her a lot of detailed financial questions, so we can get this percent for the domestic rights, royalties, and this much for international sales. And she wrote him a fascinating letter where she essentially told him, "Please don't make me think about money while I'm trying to be creative." So what she said was, "I am in love with money, so don't be mistaken. But first, I want to write great poems. After that, I'm anxious as hell to make money and fame and bring the stars all down." So isn't that interesting? She seemed to know that if she was focused on extrinsic motivators like fame and money, when she was trying to do her creative work, that would be a killer. So she was able to somehow compartmentalize all of that, which she was motivated by, but she kind of put a lid on that motivation so that she could focus on getting absorbed in her poetry. To me, that sounds a lot like she wanted to focus on her intrinsic motivation for doing that work. So all of this together led me to come up with, to articulate the intrinsic motivation principle of creativity. People are most creative when they are motivated primarily by the interest, enjoyment, satisfaction, and personal sense of challenge in the work itself, and not by external pressures or external motivators. This intrinsic motivation principle basically says you're going to be most creative when you're doing a labor of love. And it became the cornerstone of my creativity theory, which Anna mentioned a few minutes ago. I'm not going to show the whole theory, but I will show you the three basic components of creativity that are in this model. Of course, in order to be creative in a particular domain, you have to know something about that domain. And if you want to be very creative, you probably have to know quite a lot. So that's where expertise comes in. Expertise is absolutely necessary. And creative thinking skills are necessary as well. The ability to come up with a variety of ideas, come up with ideas that are quite different from ideas that other people come up with, fluency, flexibility, elaboration, and so on. The aspects of creativity that were studied by Torrance and by many of the wonderful pioneers in the field of creativity. What I added was the motivational component. That's really the contribution of my work. The notion that you need something that's a driving force to get someone to engage in something, and to engage in something in a particular way, to bring together their expertise and their creative thinking skills. And at that intersection, that's where creativity is most likely to occur. So after a while, I got really tired of just discovering how to kill creativity. It was a little bit of a downer to give talks to parents and teachers, especially about, okay, it was basically, don't do this, you know, avoid this. And that's important, right? Because a lot of the way school systems are set up kind of have these creativity killers embedded in them. So that was important, but it was a little bit discouraging. So it was fortunately right at this time that Beth Hennessy and I did an experiment that led to a very unexpected result that made us begin to think that maybe there was a way to do the opposite. So this was a study on reward and creativity, and we wanted to just do a straightforward study that would look at contracted for reward, which is an extrinsic motivator. I'm doing this in my mind, I'm doing this in order to get that money or that toy or whatever it is, versus a reward that's just part of the activity, it comes at the end, it's like a bonus. But you're not saying, okay, I will do this in order to get this reward. So in order to test this, we did there's a picture of Beth, my most frequent research collaborator and writer with me on creativity, a favorite co-author, and a very, very dear friend, whom I spoke with yesterday, and she sends her best regards to all of you. So we were looking at the effects of expected versus unexpected reward on creativity, and we did experiments with both children and adults to look at this. It was an experimental design. So I'm going to give you the basics of the design. So contracted for reward means I choose to do this activity in order to get this reward. So we crossed reward with choice. It was a 2x2 design. So we had contracted for reward, yes, I will do this activity in order to get a reward. Bonus reward, we're going to give you this activity, and you know, at the end there's this payment or there's this prize, but you're not contracting in order to do it. With the kids, this was easy. With the adults, we had to use some deception. So I'll describe the study with the adults. We had them come into the lab expecting to do an activity that was not the creativity activity that we were interested in. I don't even remember what it was. They came in to do that, and they were getting credit for a psychology course. That was their payment for coming into the lab. So the experiment was supposed to take an hour. And in the first 10 minutes, you know, everything's getting set up, and the subject is given the instructions by the experimenter, and the experimenter goes into the next room to start up the equipment. Who remembers what it was? I don't know. And the experimenter comes back and says, oh, doggone it, the machine is broken again. I'm not going to be able to have you do that experiment. But there's 50 minutes left in the hour, so no choice. So I'm going to give you this other experiment to do. Okay? So that's the no choice. And the no choice, no reward, that was it. They just did that other thing, and they went on their way, and they got their experimental credit, their course credit for it. The choice condition was, oh, doggone, the equipment's broken again, there's 50 minutes left. I have another experiment that I'm running, and people are getting paid for that. You can go now if you want to, or you can stay and get paid for doing this other thing. Okay, so they're choosing to do this other activity to get this money at the end. So that was the choice, the contracted for reward condition. And then we had no choice, no reward. You can imagine the design, okay? And we did the same kind of design with children. And then we had the products rated on creativity, and we used both verbal creativity and artistic creativity in this study. And we found, as we expected, that the lowest creativity was in the contracted for reward condition. Okay. But we found that the highest level of creativity was in the bonus reward condition. They did get a reward. They didn't contract for it, but they got it as a bonus. So this was a big surprise. We did not expect to boost creativity in any of those other conditions. We just thought we would kill creativity specifically in this one condition. So this was a little disconcerting because it showed that reward could boost creativity. And that meant that at least part of my theory was kind of wrong. And it wasn't just a little part of the theory, it was the cornerstone of the theory. So it was also, though, exciting because it suggested to Beth and me that you can, using social environmental means, boost creativity. Let's see if we can find a way to do this directly with kids. Beth is a developmental psychologist. She really wanted to see if you could do this with kids. So this led to what we call the immunization studies. And if you were at the mini conference this morning, think back on the research done by Michael Barger and Andrea Weichel. So you're here. Is Michael here? There, hi. Okay, so I think you know about the immunization studies. The stuff you presented this morning so reminded me of this, and I think it's just taking it to a different level. So I'm super excited to see about the work that you're doing. So Beth and I used a biological analogy to think through this. We thought, okay, if we can strengthen children's awareness of their intrinsic motivation for doing something, it shouldn't be so easy to undermine it. So let's try to strengthen their intrinsic motivation, and let's give them a weak form of the virus of reward. Let's give them exposure to extrinsic reward, but at the same time give them an antidote for counteracting it, okay? It's sort of a loose biological analogy, but that's how we were thinking about it. So we're trying to immunize children against the negative effects of contracted for reward on creativity. So there's something that we did before part one of this experiment. In the kids' classrooms, we asked the teachers to give them Susan Harder's measure of intrinsic motivation for learning. This was developed, I think, in the early 1980s. A pretty good measure of, and these were 4th and 5th graders that we had in the experiment. So, you know, we had a baseline measure of the kids' intrinsic motivation for learning. Then in part one of the experiment, we had the kids come into the classroom, the empty classroom we were using for the experiment. We had them come in small groups. Randomly selected small groups of kids came in. In the control group, the kids watched a video of an adult talking with a couple of children about the same age as the participants. These children were actors, and I was the adult. I like to imagine myself as an actor as well. So in this video, the adult asks the kids, Tommy and Sarah, tell me about your favorite things, your favorite foods. They talk about that for a few minutes. What are your favorite times of the year and why? Tell me about your favorite song and why. Stuff like that. Okay, so that's the control group video. So there were children in small groups, watched the video, and then after the video was shown, the experimenter talked to the kids, asked them, okay, what about you guys? What are your favorite foods, your favorite times of the year, your favorite songs? Innocuous stuff, but it lasted about as long as the experimental group. In the experimental group, we had a video of the same adult talking to the same two kids about learning in school. Tommy and Sarah, tell me about the things that you most enjoy learning in school. And Tommy talked about social studies and how he really loved what they were doing this year and learning about cultures in different parts of the world. I think they were learning about cultures in Asia, different countries in Asia, and the different foods that people eat, and the different way they do things, and the different customs that they have. I love learning about this stuff, and I like doing projects and reports where I can really go into detail on something. And Sarah talked about learning about astronomy and how she got really excited about it, and she loved taking her parents outside at night and showing them the constellations that she was learning about and the different phases of the moon, and she had a chart with the phases of the moon. So these children were modeling being really jazzed about something they were learning in school, being really intrinsically motivated to learn. And then the adult said, okay, so that was the strength, modeling strong intrinsic motivation. And next came the weak dose of extrinsic motivation. The adult said, okay, but what about getting good grades in school? Is that something that you guys think about, or getting a present or money from your parents if you do well, if you bring home a good report card? And Tommy and Sarah said things like, well, yeah, I want to get a good report card, and I want to get good marks, but that's not the most important thing for me. What's most important to me is all the stuff I'm learning that I never knew before. Okay, so kind of an antidote, a way, kind of doing what Anne Sexton did with her poem, I'm in love with money, but, leave me alone. Not while I'm doing my thing. So, experimental condition, immunization. Control condition, no immunization. Then, a few days later, a different experimenter does an experiment with the kids individually, brings them into the experimental classroom, and has them basically go through our paradigm, our creativity killing paradigm. Essentially, contracted for a reward versus a bonus reward. And we found that, and the same thing with the adults, the same basic paradigm that we had used with the adults, but the immunization studies we did with children. So the non-immunized kids showed the usual lower creativity under contracted for a reward, but ta-da, the immunized kids showed higher levels of creativity under the expected reward. Okay, so we had actually managed to flip the result by immunizing these kids. And we found that in the classroom, again, they were given this Susan Harder measure of intrinsic motivation for learning. After the experiment, the kids who were in the immunization condition showed higher levels of intrinsic motivation for learning. So what we did it made a difference for how they were thinking about what they did. We don't know how long it lasted, but I hope it lasted for at least a little while. But this gives you an idea of the kinds of things the teachers and parents might be able to do. And that's why, Andrea and Michael, I was thinking so much about this when I was listening to your research this morning. So about the time that these studies were published, I had begun scratching an intellectual itch that I'd had for quite some time, and that was a desire to know how this plays out in the real world. So I'd begun to get feel constrained by the experimental method because of the problems with ecological validity. I wanted to look at people who are out in the world trying to be creative for a living, trying to be creative in what they did every day. So it occurred to me that organizations were great natural laboratories for looking at this. because there are a lot of people inside organizations trying to do creative work. For example, trying to come up with new products, trying to come up with new processes, new systems for doing things. So I started this work by doing some interview studies with colleagues at the Center for Creative Leadership in Greensboro, North Carolina, where I was originally trained as a chemist, so of course I gravitated to looking at R&D scientists inside organizations and interviewing them about examples of highly creative projects from their recent work experience and low creativity projects. It is projects where creativity was needed and wanted, but it just didn't happen. And ask them to talk about what those projects were like, who was involved, what was the atmosphere like when you were working, what was management doing, how was management interacting with you, and so on. And through those interviews, through qualitative analysis of those interviews, I was able to identify what seemed to be stimulants to creativity, work environment stimulants to creativity, in those high creativity examples, things that kept showing up again and again. Management practices, supervisory practices, team practices, and things that kept showing up again and again in the low creativity examples. Essentially, social environmental factors in the workplace that seem to influence creativity. I distilled these into a questionnaire form called KEYS, which is an easier way to collect data than having long interviews with a bunch of people. It assesses the work environment for creativity. And we use KEYS in what I consider to be the most important study that we did on the work environment effects on creativity. So the research question was, do the work environments of high creativity R&D projects differ significantly from the work environments of low creativity R&D projects? We gave the KEYS instrument to people working on dozens of, this was a very large company. The pseudonym we use is High Tech Electronics. Dozens of projects, we gave this work environment inventory to the people working on these projects while they were doing the projects. After the projects were finished, we asked experts, these are mostly middle-level managers in the company, to rate the projects relative to one another, rate the outcome of the projects on creativity. Got decent reliability. We use that as our dependent variable, our measure of creativity. And using regressions, we were able to look at the relationship between the work environments. And in fact, I think it's okay to use the word prediction here, because we got these measures while the projects were going on, and the outcome was assessed when the project was finished. So what were the work environments really like while people were doing the projects? What was their subjective sense of the work environment? And we found that there were a number of significant differences. There were a number of work environment factors that differentiated the high creativity projects from the low creativity projects. And you can see the factors listed up there. Notice some of these were things that we had studied experimentally in the laboratory. For example, challenge is an important feature of intrinsic motivation. So having an intrinsically interesting project where you feel personally challenged by the work. Positively challenged. So we had looked at that. We had looked at autonomy, freedom, versus constraint, and how you can do. That was one of the creativity killers on my killer slide. And we had looked at the effects of expecting evaluation. And you can see that harsh evaluations are one feature of organizational impediments. This is a factor that's negatively related to the creativity of these R&D projects.
But there were so many things that we had not thought to study in the laboratory, and that, in fact, I don't know how we could have studied in a laboratory experimental method, such as work group supports, things like trust and open communication within a work group, constructively challenging each other's ideas within a work group, having a diversity of skills within the group. Supervisory encouragement includes things like setting clear goals appropriately, meaning setting clear goals for overall where we need to go with this project, but allowing autonomy in how to get there, allowing people to use their own creative thinking and deciding on the experiments to run, for example. And organizational encouragement. An organization where people have a shared vision of where the organization is trying to go, where there are mechanisms for developing new ideas, which is very important. When you're working inside an organization, you want to see your ideas actually implemented. And fostering open communication across the organization. And, interestingly, reward and recognition. Reward and recognition for creativity, which is usually an after-the-fact kind of bonus situation, at least in the organization, this organization that we were studying. The results of our studies on the work environment led to a burning question that I could only address once I moved from Brandeis University to Harvard Business School, because I needed access to a lot of companies in order to do this study, and I needed a lot more resources than I had at Brandeis University. And this led to the diary study. How does inner work life affect creativity? Notice the component in what we call inner work life has 3 psychological components. Motivation is one of them. I'm never giving up on studying motivation, right? Motivation is there, but notice that we've added emotion or affect and also perceptions. And perceptions of what's going on, what it means, sense making, and that's really perceptions of the work environment. How does inner work life, day-by-day psychology, affect creativity? And how do events at work, how do events in the workday affect inner work life? Okay, so it's really a 2-part question in this study. I really wanted to know how creativity supporting and creativity killing work environments evolve. How do they happen on a day-by-day level? And in order to do that, I felt that we had to kind of crawl inside the heads of people while they were working every day. So what we did was a kind of experience sampling methodology where we gave confidential daily electronic diaries to people working on projects that were supposed to be creative. They had to be creative in order to be successful. And these daily diaries asked them about their psychological states that day, their motivation, their emotions, and their perceptions on numerical scales. And it asked them, very importantly, briefly describe one event that occurred today that stands out in your mind. It can be anything at all, as long as it's relevant to the work or the project. And that, of course, had to be analyzed qualitatively. We had to actually go in and code all of the 75,000 events. I'm not kidding, 75,000 events that were reported in the nearly 12,000 individual daily diaries that we collected. So on average, we were able to follow these project teams. Each person in the project team filled out the daily diary individually. We asked them to please do it independently, but we wanted to get some triangulation on what events were really going on in the project. We had 7 companies that allowed us to come in and do this crazy thing, recruiting their teams. And about half the teams we recruited said, yeah, okay, we'll do this crazy thing for you. The diary took about 5 minutes to fill out, but we had people doing this every day, Monday through Friday, for on average 4 months. That's about how long, on average, the projects lasted. Also, we had, so this is just what I just described to you, okay? 238 people, 26 project teams, 7 companies in 3 different industries. We also had separate performance ratings of creativity, technical quality of the work, and a number of other things from supervisors and close colleagues of the people in the study. We did get self-ratings, but we didn't want to rely so much on the self-ratings. We wanted something more objective. Of course, this is still subjective, but at least it's multiple other individuals who knew the person's work closely. And we created a behavioral measure of day-by-day creativity from the diary stories, from the event of the day. So if someone described brainstorming, coming up with a new idea, problem solving, we coded that as a creative event. Okay, so that was a behavioral measure that we also used. I'm going to describe one of the scholarly papers, one of the studies that we did, which I think is particularly interesting, and this is the effect of one aspect of inner work life, emotion or affect, on creativity. We found that positive emotion positively predicts creativity on the same day and the next day, regardless of the next day's mood. And if you were in the mini conference, you know that I asked one of our speakers, who was that? That was Seha Mammadov, right? Yeah. I asked him about a very similar finding that he got. He got exactly the same finding in some recent research, which I got very excited about. This means that if you're in a good mood on a particular day, you have a positive emotional experience, or you're just generally in a good mood, you are not only more likely to come up with a creative idea that day, you're also more likely to come up with a creative idea the next day, regardless of what your mood is the next day. So what is, and this looks a lot like an incubation effect to me, which I had never been able to find in the laboratory. I know some other researchers have, but I never could find it in the lab. But we found it in the wild. Basically, in the study, we were looking at creativity in the wild. And that's why I'm so excited about it. The main finding from this diary study was what we call the progress principle. We published this in a book in 2011. My co-author on this research, this book, is my husband, Stephen Kramer. And he was in the list earlier, kind of in the middle of the list. So what we found when we analyzed all of the events, so we know, if people have better inner work life on a given day, they're more likely to be creative. We know from the prior research that the intrinsic motivation aspect of inner work life predicts creativity. But now we know that positive affect and positive perceptions of the work environment predict creativity. By the way, affect was nowhere in my earlier theory, but it certainly ended up there, right? It ended up there. And I have to say something that I forgot to say earlier. Rewind to the immunization studies, okay? The immunization studies and that earlier reward choice study where we found that very peculiar, surprising boost in creativity under bonus reward, that led me to realize that I had to revise the intrinsic motivation principle of creativity, right? I had to. So the revised version says, yes, intrinsic motivation facilitates creativity. That's clear. Controlling extrinsic motivation, where people feel constrained in how to do something, is likely to undermine creativity. But reward that confirms competence or allows the individual to get more deeply engaged in what they're doing or induces positive affect can boost creativity. It can act synergistically with intrinsic motivation and boost creativity. So we call this motivational synergy. And that synergistic effect is also part of the revision of my theory that I had to do. And adding affect from the study that I just showed you was another important piece that had to be added to the theory. The progress principle is another piece. So we asked the question, if inner work life is so important for creativity and productivity, which is another finding that we got, what is it that influences inner work life? What leads to positive inner work life? And we found that of all the things that can make a difference, all the good things that can happen in a workday, the single most important for inducing positive inner work life is simply making progress in meaningful work. Of all the everyday work events that can lead to positive inner work life, the single most prominent by a big margin is making progress in meaningful work. It has to be meaningful work. Anna referred to that earlier too. So we found that on people's highest positive emotion days, we found 76% of those positive, highest, best, most positive emotion days had a progress event. And 64% of people's highest intrinsic motivation days had a progress event. Setbacks, which are the opposite of progress, feeling stalled in your work or blocked somehow, or even like you're going backwards, those were most prominent in people's worst inner work life days. So it's a complete mirror image. There definitely is a dark side to the progress principle. And when we analyzed all 12,000 days of data, not just looking at the best and the worst days, but all 12,000 days of data, we found that progress positively predicted emotions and intrinsic motivation, and setbacks negatively predicted very significantly. Unfortunately, the negative effects of setbacks on inner work life are 3 to 4, any negative event, not just setbacks, the negative effects are 3 to 4 times stronger than the positive effects are in the positive direction. And this is a well-established finding in psychology that bad is stronger than good. And there are a lot of potential explanations for this, but we certainly found it in our research. And this means if you are a leader, if you are a manager, you really need to sweat the small stuff, and you really, really need to support progress and do what you can to avert setbacks in the work. They will happen, but you just need a lot more progress events than setback events. And this applies, the progress principle applies even to small wins. Even what looked to us like trivial steps forward could have an enormous positive effect on how the person felt that day, on those scale ratings of positive emotion words. And the, negative affect was way reduced. And the flip side, the opposite result, when there was a setback. So 28% of seemingly minor events of all kinds had a major impact on inner work life the day they happened. So this study, looking at the importance of meaningful work, making progress in meaningful work, put that together with the creativity and affect finding that I reported just a few minutes ago. If you put that together, what it means is if you make progress in your work on a given day, that will induce positive affect, which in turn will make creativity more likely, which is a form of progress, right? And that in turn will feed back into positive affect. So you can get these positive spirals going, these progress loops, and we did see this happening in at least one of the 7 companies which had dynamite leadership and management. The other 6, it was a bit more uneven, and one of the 7 companies was just awful. And in fact, what we saw in that one company was death spirals, where we had, setbacks after setbacks after setbacks, and all kinds of events inducing negative affect. Most prominently, those setbacks inducing negative affect, and things were really going down the tubes. So, thinking about the importance of meaningful work and making progress in meaningful work led me to wonder, after we published the progress principle, what happens when meaningful work comes to an end? At the end of someone's career. That led to the question, the research question, how does creativity influence retirement? Look at what I did here. I flipped creativity, and all of that previous research was an outcome variable, a dependent variable. Here, it's an input. How does being creative affect retirement? That's a picture of Ed Catmull in the middle. He's one of the founders of Pixar Motion Pictures, and I had the privilege of interviewing him a couple of years before he retired. And that kind of fed into my thinking about this research. So with a group of 4 wonderful senior colleagues in the Boston area, I did a retirement transitions study that just ended last year, and we published our book about a year ago. And in this study, we were looking at, this is one question out of many, 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 many questions, but this is on creativity, so I'll tell you about this one. And this is the last study I'm going to describe. How might attitudes toward an adjustment to retirement be influenced by a person's involvement in creative activity before retirement? Creative activity in their work, creative activity in their life outside of work. Okay? We interviewed 120 people and gave them background surveys, people that we recruited from 3 companies. Some of these people were millennials at the beginning of their careers. We just wanted to see how they thought about retirement, if they thought about retirement. But we focused most of our analyses on the older adults in the study, those who were still working, older pre-retirement adults. And we had retirees from the same companies, and a very interesting group of 14 people who allowed us to follow them with repeated interviews throughout their retirement transition, up to 7 years, as they finished their careers, retired, and then went into retirement life. And what we found was that life satisfaction in retirees, that is, how satisfied people were in retirement life, was significantly positively correlated with the extent to which they had creative assignments in their work before they retired and felt they actually were able to be creative in their work before retirement. There was no correlation with creativity in activities outside of work before retirement. I thought it would be just the opposite. I'm not quite sure why we got this result, so when we have our little discussion period in a minute, I'd love to hear your speculations about that. But this was a fascinating study to me, not only because it addressed that question of meaningful work. These people were doing meaningful work. And also because I was approaching retirement. I fully retired a year ago, summer of 2024. So this was highly relevant to me. And each of my co-authors was at different stages of retirement when we started the study. We're now all retired. So I'm really glad, looking back on this creativity research, that those guys at Stanford didn't laugh at me, at least not outwardly, when I told them I wanted to do the social psychology of creativity. And I feel incredibly satisfied to know that creativity is now very well respected as a subfield, not only in psychology, educational psychology, developmental psychology, also in organizational behavior journals. You see a lot of studies on creativity now, which is so wonderful. And it's very validating and satisfying to know that a social psychology of creativity has absolutely been established, not only by my work and the work of my students, but my friend and contemporary Dean Keith Simonton, working out of UC Davis, who used very different methods to look at the social psychology of creativity, but the many younger scholars who are working now in the field and adding so much to it. Many of them presented to us earlier today at the mini conference. So I'm going to end with just a couple of final thoughts. At the end of our interview, we do these long interviews in the retirements. We did. We're not doing them anymore. 215 interviews is enough. We had a question that went like this. Some people think of leaving a legacy through their work or their life. Is that something you've thought about? Well, it's something I've thought about. I realize that even in its new and improved and revised form, and in 2016, Mike Pratt of Boston College and I basically rewrote the componential theory, including affect, including synergistic extrinsic motivation, and including the progress principle, and incorporating findings from so many other researchers of these past decades. I don't think that theory is going to endure very long, unaltered. And I'm sure that some of my research findings, my empirical findings, will be upended eventually. But that's okay. You know, that's the way it's supposed to be in science, right? And that's why I think it's so important for researchers in any area to have what I've come to think of as confident humility. And that is having the confidence to pursue questions that are your labor of love. Questions that really excite you, even if others cast doubt on them. And the confidence to theorize about what your results mean. But that has to be coupled with the humility to realize you're not likely to get your theory exactly right the first time. Or maybe not even the second time. So you need to be humble enough to revise your own thinking and to be grateful to others when they improve on the work that you've done. So I'm going to leave you with a question, encouraging you to think about where you might make your most creative contributions in your work or your life. What might your labor of love be? Thank you very much.